data from Statistics South Africa shows unemployment jumped to 30.8% in the third quarter of the year. That's a 7.5 percentage point jump from the last quarter, when fewer people were actively looking for work due to the COVID-19 lockdown. Let's unpack these figures. Isabel Fryer is the director at the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Duma Qubule is from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. Isabel, let me begin with you. It feels wrong to even say, let's unpack what these numbers mean, when we've had the voices of young people who talk about their lived experience of not being able to find work, of having doors shut in their faces at every point and turn, and not knowing what to do.
Good evening, Kathy, and I think you're right. We have known for a long time that unemployment is an incredible crisis in this country. To my analysis, what we've been seeing in terms of economic growth over the past quarters and past years is now catching up with us. But you mentioned the unemployed amongst young people, and if you look at the first age cohort of 15 to 24-year-olds, you're looking at 75% of unemployment in terms of the expanded definition. So the interviews, the lived realities that were just on in terms of your news broadcast show a daily reality for the majority of people. I think just to say to that, if you look at those figures, the returns on education is so important. 53% of the unemployed have not finished matric, 36% have matric but are still unemployed. And yet you hear the stories of people saying they're dropping out because they don't have the money. Now, if you relate that specifically to the kinds of the child support grant, the social security available, we know that the levels of social security were increased during COVID to deal with some of the worst impacts of the hunger. And yet, for the majority of people who received the grant top-up, that has been stopped, and the final one will be continuing until January. So what we've seen is an incredible and basically a bloodbath of people's livelihoods. The question is how we take this forward going forward in a way that enable people to pick up their skills and not lose hope. But it's not a very pleasant figure at all.
Yeah. Duma, let me get you to weigh in here. As Isabel is saying, it's a really, really grim picture, and one absolutely feels the pain of that is expressed by young people in this country.
Kathy, this is a national disgrace. There are now, according to the expanded definition, 11.1 million unemployed people in South Africa. Since December 2008, the number of unemployed people has increased by 5.2 million. The expanded unemployment rate for black African females is 51%. The expanded unemployment rate in the Eastern Cape is 51%. The expanded unemployment rate for black Africans is 47.4%. It is heading towards 50%, at which point our whole society becomes unviable. We are facing a humanitarian crisis, and it is an absolute humanitarian crisis. This is the only thing that as South Africans we should be talking about here.
Why is it not being treated, Isabel, like the crisis that it is, or at least with the level of urgency that one would expect in a situation like that? Duma is breaking down the numbers in terms of the male-female ratio. The fact that you have black women, especially rural women, bearing the brunt of this unemployment problem is even worse, because they're the ones who generally have been excluded from the country's economy.
Absolutely. And I think the answer to the question that you ask is a very awkward answer. And that is, why is it that poverty and unemployment are not seizing the headlines? We are used to seeing headlines being expanded on issues of corruption and that require attention. But when it comes to poverty, when it comes to unemployment, year upon year, we see the figures increasing. We make the calls as civil society and as activists for some kind of intervention to happen that meets the scale of the crisis, as Duma described it, a humanitarian crisis. We see global pandemics and we commit to doing things, but when the focus disappears, we're no longer following the plight of that woman living in rural areas, the children who do not have a future because they drop out of school, and who seem set to perpetuate what's going on. I think, to my mind, we've heard too many times that there's not enough money to give to the poor. I mean, my challenge has been recently, when you look at the balance between saving lives and the economy, we intervened very early as South Africa in order to save lives. And yet the question is, what happens? Once someone's health is saved, we then cut the lifeline, which is the social grant, which enables them to have food. And in turn, as I'm sure Duma will talk to, the fact is that we cannot have an economic recovery if we don't have demand. If people do not have sufficient, firstly, to meet their own basic needs as per the constitutional right to food, as in the constitutional right to dignity, we can't kickstart the economy. And so what we're seeing now, I'm afraid, is actually going to exacerbate. So we talk about economic recovery, but we talk about a very narrow, a very elite recovery, which the question has to remain, is our society going to hold together for that to take effect? The discrepancy, the inequality, the narrowness, and yet the size of the pool of the excluded is just growing exponentially.
Duma, I want to take a look at the situation in the Eastern Cape, because you've quoted some of the figures coming out of that province. Are there a set of trends that are unique to the Eastern Cape that make the situation there so much worse than anywhere else in the country?
Kathy, I think if you look at other provinces like Limpopo, they're close behind. Northwest is about close to 50%. So it's not unique to the Eastern Cape. It's just that they've crossed the 50% threshold. And since the lockdowns at the end of March, 1.7 million people have joined the jobless queue. And I just think that, as Isabel says, it's not getting enough attention. It's not there in the public discourse. We have to be talking about it because the number of unemployed people has been increasing every year since December 2008. This is 12 years of rising unemployment, no stop. There have been so many job summits, so many investment summits, and nothing is happening. The time has come for the government to say everything that we are doing is not working. So if nothing is working, you've got to change course. And I just don't understand the government's commitments to these failed neoliberal economic policies that have got us into this crisis. At some point, we have to change policies here.
A change to what, Duma?
We are in a depression. By definition, there's not enough money in the economy. There is no way out of this crisis without putting more money into the economy. And as Isabel said, we have to provide immediate humanitarian relief to the people who are unemployed, the 11 million people who are unemployed. And then we have to create jobs for those people. We have to invest in the economy. But the government's response, the so-called fiscal stimulus, was totally inadequate. There was no 500 billion rand stimulus. By my calculation, it's about 80 to 90 billion rand that was the stimulus in this economy, and it was inadequate to the needs of our country right now.
Isabel, you know, I'm interested in the use of this being a humanitarian crisis. When one looks at where South Africa sits in terms of the youth unemployment numbers, we are the highest in the world. I mean, countries like Libya, countries like when we look at the West Bank and Gaza, these are areas that are known to be conflict prone, and yet they still are able to provide better opportunities for their young people than South Africa is. Do you see that as an indictment on the South African government?
I think, Kathy, it's an indictment on the South African society. I think that when we transitioned from 1994, there were certain glaring inequalities and structural problems that we didn't look at. Duma refers to the neoliberal economic policies that were followed. We haven't grasped the nettle of saying we are a poor developing country in reality, that the rich elite, which move us into an upper middle income country, is not the norm. I think the other thing that we need to look at is where the burden of unemployment and poverty falls. So, for instance, for white population, the unemployment rate actually fell over the last quarter. although it rose for the other population rates, so as groups. So if you look at the kind of skills, the skills benefit, those who are skilled are not in the kinds of crisis that the majority of people are. Look, I mean, Kathy, when you say, is this a government failure? The macroeconomic policies are something which need to be looked at. I think that many people were incredibly taken aback by the MTBPS messaging, which is that we don't have more money, so we won't spend more money. When we talk about the humanitarian crisis, to an extent, the question is what will make our government wake up and see? I mean, even in 2017, the Poverty Trends report that we've discussed before, 1 in 4 people are living below the starvation line. And yet that was the norm. When we talk about economic recovery, we talk about going back to where we were. And yet, when I started off in this conversation, I said that the chickens are coming home to roost. Those structural problems in which people were being excluded, basically the veneer has been pulled away. Now, the question is, what do we do? And I think that both Duma and I and a number of other people have said we need to go back to the most direct form of stimulus, and that is something such as a basic income grant. Put away ideological differences, put away concerns about the fact that you can't give poor people money because it undermines their dignity. We need to stop and say, this is what we do, these are the returns we expect, and this is how we channel. If we are saying that people have got an additional spend, then what are we doing about having local manufacturing and production as opposed to importing? I mean, I think the real challenge is that our discouraged work seekers are now 70%. So that means people who've stopped looking for work. Because, I mean, when we had the interviews with, sort of prior to this interview, you had young people saying that they're not going to look for work because there's no point. Those who've been unemployed for longer than a year have 70% are not looking for a job. Unless we term this as a humanitarian crisis, it seems that our cries fall on deaf ears. And there's also a direct link to my analysis to the pre-94 silencing and the disappearing of black people and the silencing and disappearing of the black majority who are unemployed and poor in this current situation. So what I'm not saying is that our current government is a racist government. I'm saying, how do we ensure that what is affecting the majority of people who are not included and have not for generations been included in this constitution, that we manage to turn it around so it is the constitution that looks to the majority and not the minority or privilege.
Duma, I'm going to give you the last word on this matter.
This is an indictment on the government's policies. After 12 years of rising unemployment, the medium-term budget policy statement is condemning South Africans to 3 more years of deep budget cuts, 300 billion rands that will be taken from the wages of the public servants, and that will plunge the economy into 3 more years of rising unemployment. Now, by the end of 15 years of rising unemployment, it will even be worse than it is now.
Duma Qobule, Isabel Fryer, let me thank you both for your time on News at Prime tonight. Certainly a huge crisis that the country has on its hands, that is facing also, in the majority, young people of this country. How do we begin to turn things around and give young people hope? Give them a sense that they have a future to look forward to in this country. These are the real questions that need to be answered. We'll take